Ever wondered which is a better investment, QQQ or XLK? Today we're going to tackle this head-on by comparing their investment performances. We'll be focusing on key metrics such as start and end balances, annualized return, standard deviation, best and worst year performances, maximum drawdown, Sharpe and Sortino ratios, and expense ratio. These indicators will give us a comprehensive view of the strengths and weaknesses of each fund. So let's dive in and see which of these two funds comes out on top. Let's start with the basics, the performance summary. Both the QQQ and XLK funds kicked off with a starting balance of $10,000. Yet their end balances tell a different story. The QQQ fund grew to a commendable $49,999. However, the XLK fund outshone it, ballooning to an impressive $61,773. Now let's turn our attention to the annualized return, also known as the compound annual growth rate, or CAGR for short. QQQ had a solid annualized return of 18.46%. But once again, XLK took the lead with an annualized return of 21.13%. Taking a look at the standard deviation, which measures the volatility or risk associated with the return of an investment, QQQ had a standard deviation of 18.93%. XLK had a slightly higher standard deviation of 19.43%, indicating marginally higher volatility. The best year for QQQ saw a return of 54.85%, while XLK's best year edged out slightly ahead at 56.02%. On the flip side, QQ faced a challenging year with a return of negative 32.58%, while XLK's worst year was less severe, with a return of negative 27.73%. Moving on to the maximum drawdown, which is the largest single drop from peak to bottom in the value of a portfolio, QQQ's maximum drawdown was negative 32.58%. XLK had a slightly smaller maximum drawdown of negative 31.22%. Lastly, let's tackle the Sharpe ratio, Sortino ratio, and expense ratio. The Sharpe and Sortino ratios measure risk-adjusted returns, with QQQ's ratios at 0.91 and 1.52 respectively, while XLK's ratios are slightly higher at 1.01 and 1.73. The expense ratio of QQQ is 0.2%, while XLK's is a lower 0.09%. As we can see, both funds have their strengths and weaknesses, but the differences become clearer when we dig deeper. Now let's take a closer look at these figures. First off, both funds started with the same balance of $10,000. QQQ grew its balance to $49,999, but XLK outperformed it, growing to $61,773. This difference in end balance is a direct reflection of each fund's annualized return or compound annual growth rate, CAGR, which measures the mean annual growth rate of an investment over a specified period of time. QQQ had an annualized return of 18.46%. However, XLK once again outperformed QQQ with an annualized return of 21.13%. This higher return rate means that, on average, XLK grew more each year than QQQ. Standard deviation measures the dispersion of a set of values from their mean. In this context, it indicates the volatility of the fund. QQQ had a standard deviation of 18.93%, while XLK had a slightly higher standard deviation of 19.43%. This higher standard deviation means that XLK was slightly more volatile than QQQ. Now let's look at the best and worst years for each fund. QQQ's best year saw a return of 54.85%, while XLK's best year was marginally better at 56.02%. On the flip side, QQQ experienced a worst year return of negative 32.58%, while XLK had a better worst year performance with a return of negative 27.73%. The maximum drawdown is the maximum observed loss from a peak to a trough of a portfolio before a new peak is attained. QQQ's maximum drawdown was negative 32.58%, while XLK had a slightly smaller maximum drawdown of negative 31.22%. Finally, let's discuss the Sharpe ratio, Sortino ratio, and expense ratio. The Sharpe ratio measures the average return earned in excess of the risk-free rate per unit of volatility. The higher the Sharpe ratio, the better the fund's returns have been relative to the risk it has taken on. QQQ had a Sharpe ratio of 0.91, while XLK had a higher Sharpe ratio of 1.01. The Sortino ratio is a variation of the Sharpe ratio, but penalizes only those returns falling below a user-defined target or required rate of return. QQQ had a Sortino ratio of 1.52, with XLK again outperforming at 1.73. Lastly, the expense ratio represents the percentage of the fund's assets that go toward running the fund. QQQ had an expense ratio of 0.2%, while XLK boasted a lower expense ratio of 0.09%. So we've dissected the numbers, but what do they mean for you as an investor? To wrap up, let's summarize what we've learned. Both QQQ and XLK started with the same initial balance of $10,000. However, XLK surpassed QQQ, growing to $61,773 compared to QQQ's $49,999. In terms of annualized return, XLK again outperformed QQQ, delivering a return of 21.13% compared to QQQ's 18.46%. Although XLK showed slightly higher volatility, it also demonstrated better performance in its best and worst years. Moreover, XLK had a slightly smaller maximum drawdown than QQQ. However, it's essential to consider that higher returns often come with higher risk, as indicated by XLK's higher standard deviation. The differences between these two funds highlight the importance of understanding each fund's performance metrics when making investment decisions. Remember, every investment comes with its risks and rewards, but with careful analysis, you can make informed decisions that align with your financial goals.